What happens when a millionaire finds an expired cake for his daughter? The question arrived like a bright punctuation mark over a sunlit street. A small bakery window, a row of cakes gleaming under glass, afternoon light pouring in like warm honey. Outside, polished shoes slowed to a stop. Inside, the world smelled of butter and sugar, of caramel cooling on pastry racks, and yeast still warm from the oven. A man in a tailored coat stood in that light, Roland Vance, careful in his movements, the sort of man who measured time in meetings and margins. He moved through the bakery as though stepping into another language, softer, less hurried. Near the doorway, a woman hovered with a child at her hip. Marissa moved with the cautious economy of someone who'd learned how to make one decision stretch farther than it should. Her jacket had the soft, dull sheen of too many washes. Her hands kept finding the strap of the bag she carried. Flora, 7 or so, stood a little apart from the curb like a bird waiting for permission to hop. Her eyes found a strawberry-topped cake behind glass and lingered, not quite asking, only longing. A baker in a flour-dusted apron was folding a paper bag closed. Beside him rested a cake under a small sticker, a pastel label with a blunt sentence, "Past sell-by." The staff had already begun setting aside unsold items. Heaped in a corner were loaves and pastries that the rules said could no longer be sold. Someone would take them home for compost, perhaps, or the staff would bring them later to a shelter. No one bartered. It was policy, simple and impersonal. When a hand reached for the discarded cake, the room softened. The baker hesitated, eyes flicking to Marissa, then to Roland. "It's past date," he said, not unkindly. "We can't put it out again." He didn't say it to shame. He said it because he believed in rules that kept stores running and people safe. Marissa's voice barely lifted. Would you have anything like that? For my girl." There was no dramatic plea in it, just a quiet asking, the sort that lives on the edge of dignity and need. Roland could have stepped away. He could have paid for a cake with a card so new the chip shone. He could have left the bakery and slipped back into schedule and comfort.
He could have kept the photograph folded in his pocket and told Lily later that he had bought something special. Instead, he looked at the cake, at the little sticker that said it could not be sold, at Flora's knuckles white around the hem of her coat, and felt something thin in him unbutton. If this moment lands with you, and you believe kindness matters, consider subscribing to follow more real-life moments like this. He watched a flitting of faces, the baker's, the cashier's, Marissa's, and saw not a tableau, but the whole of small, ordinary lives. He thought of Lily waiting at home, of the way a child imagines the world as a cupboard that fills with gifts and laughter. He thought, too, of how the walls he'd built to keep grief and decision neat had the curious habit of isolating him from the very things he wanted to teach his daughter. Roland stepped forward and did something intentionally unspectacular. He tapped his card against the counter and asked the baker to pack the best cakes in a paper box. He paid without a pause, as if this were pity exchange, not education. Then, an instant later, quieter than the purchase, as though it were an afterthought or a secret he couldn't keep, he asked if the cake with the sticker could be given to the little girl. "I was going to take it for my daughter," he said, the sentence landing in the air like a small, oddly vulnerable confession. "But if it's okay, could she have it?" The baker straightened. The cashier's eyes softened with practiced civility turned human. The policy was a thing, compassion is another. They hadn't been asked to be cruel, only to keep order. No one needed to be shamed for that. They could, however, choose to bend to an immediate kindness. Marissa blinked as if he'd offered her a door open onto a warmer street. Flora's mouth parted in surprise. She reached, not to snatch, but to accept the offering with all a child's gravity. The expired cake, slightly drier at its edges, still shimmered with a thin coat of glaze. It smelled of sugar and the faintly medicinal tang of preserved fruit. Not dangerous, just not ideal. The baker gave a small, practical nod. It was past the date for sale, he said, but the ingredients were fine. It could be eaten. There was no drama in that assurance. It was fact. Roland handed the wrapped box and the card together. He stayed long enough to watch Marissa's face rearrange itself into something that looked like relief. He could have stayed longer. He didn't because he wanted the act to be simple, unannounced, not a performance for his ledger. But the story didn't end on the sidewalk. It moved into a scene that required something softer, an economy of gestures rather than statements. Claire, the cashier, leaned in and added a small paper bag with 2 warm croissants. "On the house," she said. It was not a broadcast. She did not ask for thanks.
She had seen a need and answered the way service minds sometimes do, by making the small extra that matters. On the bench outside, Flora held the cake like a secret treasure. Her fingers found a corner of frosting and tested it. A cautious smile unfurled across her face, the kind a child makes when discovery feels like victory rather than alms. Marissa laughed, once, a sound like a stone dropped into still water, sending out small ripples. She didn't cry. She exhaled, and something in her shoulders eased. Roland lingered only a moment longer. He watched them walk away, watched the small bag swing at Marissa's side, watched the way Flora clutched the cake to her chest. He slipped the photograph of Lily back into his wallet with the same care he'd used to take the wallet from his pocket. On the walk home, his steps were the same in tempo, but lighter in some invisible weight. The moment had not made him a saint. It had not cured anything epic. It had, however, changed how he moved through the rest of that day. That evening, in a kitchen bathed in late light, Lily sat at the table with a fork in her small hand. The box he had bought her, a plain thing at first glance, held a cake with fresh strawberries, the sort children assume all gifts should be. She tilted her head when he set it down. "Where's the other cake?" she asked, because children keep track of small details the way bees find flowers. Roland told a shortened version of what had happened. He could have said, "I bought this because you're my daughter." He did say that, but he added something else. He explained that there had been another cake, a cake that was being thrown away, and that he had given it to a little girl who needed it more that afternoon. He folded the truth into words simple enough for 7 years. "I thought she would like a treat more than we needed 2 cakes at our table." Lily's forehead wrinkled, not with regret, but with the earnestness of a child calibrating fairness. "You gave her our cake?" she asked. Roland watched the wheels move behind her eyes. He had not planned a lecture, he had planned an act. But he realized in that small domestic light that every action is a lesson. He told her why, not with the heaviness of guilt, but with the quietness of someone who tries to model an answer to an unspoken question. What do we do when someone else needs? Lily considered the fresh cake, then the idea of another child with a sticky mouth and a grateful tilt to her head. "Can I make her a card?" she asked. The question was earnest and uncomplicated. In her notion, there was no shame in asking for another to be cared for. Rather, it was a small mathematics of joy. 1 cake plus 1 card equals 2 people smiling. That night they sat at the table and drew a small, clumsy card, a picture of 2 cakes on one page, 3 flowers on the next. Roland watched his daughter put her name on the back with a flourish. He thought of the afternoon's light, the way the expired cake had looked under that sticker, like a thing the world was ready to set aside. He thought of his own daughter learning to give away something she had asked for, and how that teaching reframed what it meant to be wealthy. The change that followed wasn't dramatic. Marissa's life did not rearrange itself because of 1 cake. The bakery continued to follow its rules and to pamper its loyal customers. But small human currents shifted. The baker began, weeks later, to tuck aside certain unsold items for a small community board where those in need might ask. He didn't make flyers or speak of it to anyone. He simply put a note that said, "If you need, ask." It was private, quiet, and practical, dignity preserved. Marissa paid forward in small increments that mattered. She took on an extra shift at a daycare, found a used jacket for Flora to wear in the spring. Flora kept the card from Lily in a box with a secret collection of marbles and buttons. She told no one the exact shape of that afternoon's gratitude, but held it like a talisman against the afternoons that gapped larger. Roland, for his part, found that the photograph of Lily in his wallet stopped being only a keepsake and became a reminder. He began to schedule his life around the small things, a Wednesday afternoon free for the school play, a Saturday morning for pancakes. He didn't transform overnight into a different man, but he began to notice. A habit of noticing is the seed of change. So what happens in the end when a millionaire finds an expired cake for his daughter? The cake itself, with its slightly dry edges and its faintly medicinal tang, becomes less an object of expiration than a hinge. It swings open a slice of compassion, an everyday generosity that costs little to the giver and everything to the receiver, in the beautiful way that dignity is returned. It becomes a lesson that can be carried home and taught at a kitchen table. Not every act has sweeping consequences, and no one on that street walked away with a tidy fix to life's deeper difficulties. But something essential moved. A man learned to choose empathy where indifference might have been easier.
A child learned that generosity can begin by giving what you want. A mother felt, briefly and crucially, that she and her child were seen by another human being. The expired cake was both literal and symbolic. It was a cake that had reached a store's sell-by date, and it was also the idea that people and things labeled past still have tastes and uses that the world ought not to discard casually. The better story, perhaps, is that people are more like cakes than we think, past moments, fragile edges, but still full of potential sweetness. In the quiet that followed, Roland often returned in memory to the way Flora had clutched that cake as if she were holding a promise. He kept giving in small ways, and he kept learning that generosity needs no audience.
He learned, too, that teaching a child how to see another's need is one of the most practical things a parent can do. There are no grand miracles here, no instant solutions. What there is dignity restored in small measures, empathy that ripples outward, and a lesson wrapped in waxed paper that a child can carry home. The cake did not make anyone rich, but it made several afternoons better, and sometimes better is enough. Do you believe a small act can change someone's life? Tell us why in the comments.